December 19, 1944. The forests of the Ardennes lay buried under snow. The winter air was sharp and motionless. Frost clung to pine branches and narrow roads disappeared beneath thick layers of ice and mud. Across this frozen landscape, the largest German offensive in the Western Front since Normandy was already underway. 3 days earlier, thousands of German artillery guns had shattered the quiet dawn. Armored columns had surged through the forests, smashing into thin American lines. Entire divisions were pushed back. Communications failed. Confusion spread through headquarters. German planners believed the shock alone would paralyze the Allied command structure for weeks. Their calculations were precise. Their assumptions were logical. But they had underestimated one man. Hundreds of miles to the south, inside the headquarters of the U.S. Third Army, General George S.C.S. Patton was already studying maps. While German generals believed the Allies would need 2 weeks to react, Patton was preparing to move an entire army in just 2 days. Within 48 hours, more than 250,000 soldiers would begin one of the most astonishing operational turns in modern warfare. And the fate of Bastogne would soon depend on it. By the autumn of 1944, the war in Western Europe appeared to be entering its final phase. Only months earlier, on June 6, 1944, Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy during the historic D-Day. The landings had opened a second front in Western Europe and shattered German defenses along the Atlantic coast. Within weeks, Allied armies had broken out of Normandy and surged across France. Paris was liberated in August. German forces retreated rapidly toward their own borders, pursued by American, British, and Canadian armies advancing on a broad front. Many Allied commanders believed the collapse of Nazi Germany might come sooner than expected, but victory was proving more complicated than anticipated. The Allied advance had stretched supply lines to the limit. Fuel, ammunition, and food had to travel hundreds of miles from the beaches of Normandy to damaged roads and railways. Trucks ran almost constantly in what soldiers called the Red Ball Express, a massive logistical effort that struggled to keep the advancing armies supplied. As autumn deepened, progress slowed. The German army, though battered, had not collapsed. It withdrew toward defensive positions along the Rhine River, preparing for a final defense of the homeland. Meanwhile, Allied strategy became divided. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery pushed for a bold thrust through the Netherlands toward the Ruhr industrial region. In September, the ambitious airborne operation known as Operation Market Garden attempted to seize a series of bridges and open a rapid route into Germany. But the operation failed. German resistance proved stronger than expected, and the final bridge at Arnhem remained in German hands. The failure left Allied forces stalled along the Dutch border as winter approached. At the same time, American forces were fighting difficult battles along the German frontier. Dense forests, fortified towns, and stubborn German defenders slowed the advance. One of the most brutal areas was the Hürtgen Forest, where U.S. troops fought a grinding and costly campaign against entrenched German units. Weeks of fighting produced heavy casualties and little progress. By November 1944, the war in the West had settled into a tense stalemate. The Allies possessed overwhelming resources: more men, more aircraft, more vehicles, and a growing industrial advantage. But the final push into Germany was proving slower than expected. On the other side of the front, German leadership faced a desperate situation. Germany was now fighting on 2 massive fronts. In the east, the Red Army was advancing relentlessly toward Berlin. Soviet forces had already pushed deep into Eastern Europe and stood poised to launch new offensives into German territory. In the west, Allied armies threatened the Rhine. For Adolf Hitler, the strategic situation was unacceptable. Yet Hitler believed a bold counterattack could still change the course of the war. His idea was audacious. Instead of defending passively, Germany would launch a massive surprise offensive through the same region where the Germans had attacked in 1940, the heavily forested Ardennes. The goal would be nothing less than a dramatic breakthrough across Allied lines. German armored forces would drive westward through Belgium, cross the Meuse River, and capture the vital port city of Antwerp. If successful, the attack would split the Allied armies in 2. British and Canadian forces in the north would be separated from the American armies in the south. Allied logistics would collapse. Political divisions between the Allies might deepen. Hitler believed the Western powers might even consider negotiating peace. To achieve this, Germany assembled one final offensive force. More than 200,000 German soldiers, supported by hundreds of tanks and assault guns, were secretly concentrated along the Ardennes front. The operation carried the code name Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Secrecy was essential. German commanders knew that if Allied intelligence detected the buildup, the plan would fail. So the preparations were conducted with extreme caution. Troops moved mostly at night. Radio silence was enforced. Deceptive messages were transmitted elsewhere along the front. Meanwhile, the Allied command believed the Ardennes sector was relatively quiet. The region was rugged, forested, and poorly suited for large-scale armored warfare during winter. Because of this, the sector was considered a secondary front, a place where tired divisions could rest or inexperienced units could gain combat experience. American units holding the Ardennes line were spread thin across long defensive sectors. Many soldiers believed the worst of the fighting in Western Europe was already over. But hidden inside the forests beyond their lines, German armored columns were gathering, and in just a few days, the silence of the Ardennes would explode into one of the largest and most dangerous battles the Western Front had ever seen. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, the quiet forests of the Ardennes erupted into violence. At 5:30 a.m., more than 1,500 German artillery guns opened fire simultaneously across an 80-mile front. Shells screamed through the dark winter sky, crashing into American positions hidden among the trees. Command posts, communication lines, and artillery batteries were struck in rapid succession. The sudden bombardment shattered the fragile calm of the sector. Within minutes, German infantry began advancing through the forests under the cover of smoke and snow. Behind them came armored columns, tanks, assault guns, and mechanized infantry pushing westward along narrow roads carved through the woods. For the American soldiers defending the Ardennes, the attack was overwhelming. Many units holding the line were inexperienced or exhausted from previous operations. Some had only recently arrived in the area for what commanders believed would be a quiet sector. Communications quickly broke down. Telephone wires were severed by artillery. Radio signals became unreliable. Road junctions filled with refugees, military vehicles, and retreating troops trying to reorganize under heavy pressure. German forces exploited the confusion. Armored spearheads began pushing through weak points in the American defenses, creating a large bulge in the Allied front line. A protrusion that would later give the battle its famous name, the Battle of the Bulge. The German plan depended on speed. If their armored divisions could break through the Ardennes quickly and reach the Meuse River, the road to Antwerp would open. Capturing the port would sever Allied supply lines and potentially split the Western Allied armies into separate northern and southern groups. To achieve this, several German armies advanced simultaneously. Elite units such as the 6th SS Panzer Army attacked in the north, while the 5th Panzer Army drove through the central Ardennes. Farther south, the 7th Army attempted to protect the offensive southern flank. At first, the surprise worked. Several American units were forced to retreat. Others became isolated in small pockets of resistance. German armored columns captured towns and road networks deep behind Allied lines. Yet geography soon began to shape the battle. The Ardennes region was filled with narrow roads winding through dense forests and steep valleys. Movement was difficult even in good weather. In winter, with snow and ice covering the ground, progress became even slower. This made certain locations strategically critical. One of the most important was the small Belgian town of Bastogne. At first glance, Bastogne appeared insignificant, a quiet town surrounded by farmland and forests. But it sat at the center of 7 major road networks crossing the Ardennes. Any army attempting to move large numbers of tanks and supply vehicles through the region needed those roads. If German forces captured Bastogne, their armored divisions could move freely toward the Meuse River. If the Allies held it, the German advance would slow dramatically. American commanders quickly recognized the danger. As German columns pushed westward, Allied headquarters began rushing reinforcements toward the Crossroads town. Among the units ordered into the area was the 101st Airborne Division, which arrived in freezing weather with limited supplies. Soon the town would become surrounded by German forces. Meanwhile, Allied leadership struggled to understand the full scale of the German attack. Reports from the front were incomplete and often contradictory. Some commanders initially believed the offensive was only a local counterattack, but as new information arrived, the situation became clear. This was a massive German offensive, the largest on the Western Front since Normandy. On December 19, 1944, senior Allied commanders gathered in the city of Verdun for an urgent strategic conference. Among them was Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. The question facing the Allied leadership was simple but urgent. How quickly could they counterattack and stop the German advance? Many believed it would take weeks to reorganize the scattered Allied forces and launch a coordinated response. But one commander at the meeting had already been thinking about that possibility. For days, General George S. Patton had been studying the developing situation and quietly preparing his army for a sudden change in direction. When Eisenhower asked how quickly an American counterattack could begin, most commanders hesitated. Patton did not. His answer would surprise everyone in the room and set in motion one of the most remarkable maneuvers of the entire war. By the third day of the German offensive, the battle unfolding across the Ardennes was no longer a simple clash of armies. It had become a complex struggle shaped by terrain, leadership, human endurance, and the unpredictable chaos of winter warfare. To understand how the situation reached such a critical point, it is necessary to look at the battle from several different perspectives. For the American soldiers scattered across the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the first days of the offensive were filled with confusion and uncertainty. Many units had arrived in the sector expecting a quiet period away from the heavy fighting along the German frontier. Instead, they woke to one of the largest surprise attacks of the war. Snow covered the ground. Temperatures dropped well below freezing at night. Roads were slippery and difficult to navigate, even for experienced drivers. Under these conditions, soldiers often found themselves isolated. German armored columns pushed through gaps in the lines, cutting off supply routes and communication networks. Entire companies were suddenly surrounded in small villages or forest clearings. For many troops, survival depended on holding defensive positions long enough for reinforcements to arrive. One of the most dramatic examples would soon unfold in the small town of Bastogne. American paratroopers from the 104th Airborne Division rushed into the area and began digging defensive positions around the town. Within days, German forces surrounded them. The soldiers inside Bastogne faced freezing temperatures, limited ammunition, and constant artillery fire. Medical supplies were scarce. Many wounded men waited hours, sometimes days, before receiving treatment. Yet the defenders continued to hold their ground. Their resistance would buy precious time for Allied commanders to organize a larger response. While soldiers fought for survival on the ground, military planners on both sides understood that geography would determine the course of the battle. The Ardennes was a difficult place for large armies to maneuver. Dense forests, narrow roads, and steep terrain restricted the movement of armored units. Unlike the open plains of France, tanks could not easily spread out across the countryside. Instead, they were forced to move along specific road networks. This made certain locations strategically critical. The town of Bastogne sat at the center of 7 major roads connecting the northern and southern sections of the Ardennes. These routes allowed armored divisions to move quickly toward the Meuse River, the next major objective of the German offensive. If German forces captured Bastogne intact, their tanks could advance rapidly toward the river and potentially break through Allied defenses before reinforcements arrived. But if Bastogne remained in Allied hands, the German advance would slow dramatically. Armored units would be forced to detour onto smaller roads, creating traffic congestion and logistical delays. In large-scale mechanized warfare, time and mobility often determine success. And in the Ardennes, Bastogne represented both. At the same moment that American soldiers fought to hold Bastogne, another crucial factor was shaping the battle far to the south. General George S. Patton commanded the powerful U.S. Third Army, which was operating along the southern portion of the Western Front. Patton had developed a reputation for aggressive maneuver warfare. Unlike some commanders who preferred cautious advances, Patton believed speed and momentum could overwhelm enemy defenses. His armies moved quickly, often covering large distances in short periods of time. But Patton was also known for careful preparation. In the days before the German offensive fully unfolded, he had already begun considering how his army might respond if a major attack occurred in the Ardennes. While other Allied commanders were still analyzing reports from the front, Patton had quietly instructed his staff to begin drafting contingency plans. These plans explored the possibility of redirecting the entire Third Army northward. Such a maneuver would be extremely difficult. It would require hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of vehicles, and massive supply columns to pivot across winter roads while still maintaining combat readiness. Few commanders believed such a movement could be executed quickly. Yet, Patton's staff continued refining the plans. They studied road networks. They prepared alternate supply routes. They examined how artillery and armored divisions could be repositioned in the shortest possible time. By the time Allied leaders gathered for the emergency conference on December 19, 1944, something unusual had already happened, while others were still calculating what might be possible. Patton already knew exactly what his army could do, and the moment was approaching when he would reveal that plan to the highest Allied command. By December 19, 1944, the battle raging across the Battle of the Bulge had evolved into a race against time. German armored columns were pushing west through the Ardennes, while American units attempted to slow them long enough for reinforcements to arrive. But beyond the battlefield itself, several deeper forces were shaping how the struggle would unfold. Understanding these forces reveals why the coming maneuver by George S. Patton would become so extraordinary. When German planners designed the Ardennes offensive, they knew their chances of ultimate victory were uncertain. Germany lacked the industrial capacity and fuel reserves needed for a prolonged campaign. The operation depended on speed and surprise. If their armored spearheads could break through Allied defenses quickly, they might create enough confusion to paralyze the Allied command structure. German leaders believed the Allies would require significant time to reorganize after the shock of the attack. Many estimates suggested that a coordinated Allied counteroffensive could take 2 weeks or more to assemble. This assumption shaped the entire German plan. Armored divisions were expected to advance rapidly toward the Meuse River, seize key bridges, and continue toward Antwerp before Allied forces could respond effectively. For several days after the attack began, German commanders believed events were unfolding according to plan. American units were retreating in some sectors. Road networks were crowded with withdrawing vehicles and civilian refugees. The front line had bulged dramatically westward. Yet the German advance was already encountering difficulties. Traffic jams formed along narrow forest roads. Fuel shortages slowed some armored columns. American resistance in key locations, particularly around Bastogne, disrupted the timetable. Even so, German leaders remained confident that the Allies would need considerable time to mount a large-scale counterattack. They did not yet realize that preparations for such a response had already begun. In modern warfare, the movement of large armies depends on far more than simply issuing orders. Behind every infantry division stand thousands of vehicles, artillery batteries, supply trucks, engineering units, medical teams, and communication networks. The U.S. Third Army, commanded by Patton, was enormous. More than 250,000 soldiers were spread across a wide sector of the front. Thousands of tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery pieces supported them. Each day, enormous quantities of fuel, ammunition, and food had to be transported to the front lines. Turning such a force in a new direction was not simply a matter of issuing a command. Entire supply routes had to be redirected. Traffic patterns on hundreds of miles of roads had to be reorganized. Units positioned along the front had to disengage from the enemy and reposition without creating dangerous gaps in the line. And all of this had to occur during winter. Snow and ice made many roads hazardous. Bridges could become bottlenecks for heavy vehicles. Long columns of trucks risked becoming trapped in traffic if movements were not carefully coordinated. Military planners normally expected such redeployments to take many days, sometimes weeks. Yet Patton's staff had been quietly studying these logistical problems in advance. Maps had been examined, alternate road routes had been identified. Orders had been drafted that could be issued immediately if the situation required a sudden shift. This preparation meant that when the moment came, the Third Army would not be starting from scratch. Instead, it would execute a plan that had already been carefully considered. Winter weather played a decisive role in the early stages of the Ardennes offensive. Heavy cloud cover and snowstorms grounded most Allied aircraft. Normally, Allied air power dominated the skies over Western Europe. Fighter bombers attacked German columns, destroyed vehicles, and disrupted troop movements. But during the first days of the German offensive, aircraft could barely operate. The cloudy skies provided crucial protection for German armored divisions moving through the forests. This made speed even more important. If the weather cleared before German forces reached their objectives, Allied aircraft would return and begin attacking the long supply column supporting the offensive. At the same time, winter conditions made it harder for Allied forces to reposition quickly. Snow-covered roads slowed vehicle movement. Freezing temperatures tested both soldiers and machines. Every hour lost in organizing a counterattack increased the danger, which meant that the decision taken by Allied commanders on December 19, 1944, would carry enormous consequences. That morning, senior leaders gathered in Verdun to discuss how the Allied armies could respond to the German breakthrough. Some believed it might take weeks to launch a major counterattack, but when the question was finally asked, how soon could an American army strike back, one general delivered an answer no one expected, and that answer would immediately change the course of the battle. On the morning of December 19, 1944, senior Allied commanders gathered in the war-scarred French city of Verdun. The location itself carried symbolic weight. During the First World War, Verdun had been the site of one of the longest and bloodiest battles in European history. Now, nearly 3 decades later, the city once again hosted a meeting that could shape the future of the war. Inside a cold conference room, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D.T. Eisenhower sat with several of his most senior generals. The situation map spread across the table was troubling. German forces had punched a deep wedge into the Allied lines across the Ardennes. Armored columns were moving west through snow-covered roads. American divisions had been scattered and pushed back. The front line now bulged outward across Belgium. Reports indicated that German units were advancing toward key road networks, including the town of Bastogne, where American paratroopers were already fighting to hold their positions. The German plan was becoming clear. If their armored divisions could reach the Meuse River, the path toward Antwerp might open. That would threaten to divide the Allied armies and create a major strategic crisis. Eisenhower needed to organize a response quickly. Around the table sat several experienced commanders, including British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and American General Omar Bradley. Each man studied the map carefully. The problem was not simply stopping the German advance. The Allies needed to strike the flanks of the German penetration and cut off the armored spearheads pushing westward. But organizing such a counterattack required time. Divisions would need to reposition. Supply routes would need to be established. Artillery and armored units would have to be coordinated. Under normal circumstances, assembling such a response could take many days. Eisenhower began asking his commanders how soon they could launch major counterattacks. Several possibilities were discussed. Plans were considered. The conversation moved cautiously, shaped by the harsh realities of winter warfare and the enormous logistical challenges involved. Then Eisenhower turned to one man at the table. General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, had been listening quietly. His army was currently positioned far to the south of the German breakthrough, engaged in operations along the German frontier. Eisenhower asked a simple question. If necessary, how soon could Patton's army attack north toward the German flank? Many of the officers in the room expected the answer to involve careful calculations. Patton responded almost immediately. He told Eisenhower that his army could begin attacking within 48 hours. The room fell silent. For most commanders present, such a timetable seemed almost impossible. Turning a force of more than 250,000 soldiers, along with thousands of vehicles, tanks, artillery batteries, and supply columns, was an enormous logistical undertaking. Roads were icy, units were spread across a wide front. Enemy forces still occupied nearby positions. Normally, a maneuver of that scale would require weeks of preparation. Yet Patton spoke with complete confidence. What the other commanders did not yet know was that Patton had already anticipated the possibility of a German attack through the Ardennes. Days earlier, he had quietly instructed his staff to prepare contingency plans for redirecting the Third Army northward. These plans were detailed. They included alternate road routes for armored divisions, revised supply lines for fuel and ammunition, and carefully coordinated marching schedules for dozens of units. When Eisenhower asked if the Third Army could attack in 2 days, Patton was not making a guess. He was describing a plan that already existed. The moment the meeting ended, the orders would begin moving through the command chain. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers would receive new instructions, and an entire army would begin turning north. But announcing the plan was only the beginning. Now the real challenge lay ahead, executing one of the most complex operational maneuvers of the entire war in the middle of a brutal European winter. The moment the meeting in Verdun ended on December 19, 1944, orders began flowing out from the headquarters of General George S. Patton. Across a wide front in eastern France and Luxembourg, units of the U.S. Third Army were preparing to execute one of the most complex maneuvers of the war. Instead of continuing their advance east toward Germany, the entire army would pivot north, directly toward the German penetration in the Ardennes. For the soldiers receiving the orders, the change was dramatic. Divisions that had been facing east suddenly had to turn their vehicles, artillery, and supply columns toward the north. Convoys that had been traveling along established supply routes were redirected onto new roads. Staff officers worked around the clock to coordinate the movement. Maps were spread across command tables. Road networks were studied carefully. Traffic schedules were organized to prevent thousands of vehicles from becoming trapped in massive traffic jams along narrow winter roads. The scale of the operation was enormous. More than 250,000 American soldiers were involved in the maneuver. Armored divisions, infantry units, artillery batteries, engineers, medical teams, and supply columns all had to move in a carefully coordinated sequence. Thousands of trucks carrying fuel, ammunition, and food joined the long columns moving north. The winter weather made the operation even more difficult. Snow covered the countryside. Many roads were icy and dangerous for heavy vehicles. Bridges had to support the weight of tanks and armored vehicles moving across them in long convoys. Yet the movement continued. Hour after hour, columns of American vehicles rolled through towns and villages across northeastern France. Civilians watched as tanks, artillery pieces, and endless lines of trucks passed through their streets. In many places, traffic moved through the night. Headlights were often dimmed or covered to reduce the risk of attracting German aircraft. Drivers navigated unfamiliar roads in freezing temperatures, sometimes guided only by small signs placed by military police along the route. Meanwhile, farther north, the situation around Bastogne was becoming increasingly desperate. The 101st Airborne Division and other American units defending the town were now surrounded by German forces. Snowstorms continued to ground most Allied aircraft, making it difficult to deliver supplies or evacuate wounded soldiers. German artillery pounded the town regularly, attempting to break the defenders' resistance. German commanders believed time was on their side. Their armored divisions were still pushing westward. The Allied response appeared slow and disorganized. What they did not yet fully understand was that a massive American force was already moving toward them. By December 21, leading elements of the Third Army had reached positions south of the German penetration. The next step was to begin attacking north toward Bastogne. American armored and infantry divisions pushed forward through difficult terrain, encountering German defensive positions along the way. Fighting intensified as the advancing units attempted to break through the outer ring of German forces surrounding the town. The battle was fierce. German troops, aware of the importance of Bastogne, fought hard to maintain the encirclement. Road junctions and small villages became scenes of intense combat as American units pushed northward through snow-covered fields and forests. But the momentum was now shifting. The speed of Patton's maneuver had disrupted German expectations. Instead of facing a delayed Allied response, German forces suddenly found themselves threatened by a powerful counterattack from the south. On December 26, 1944, elements of the Third Army finally broke through German lines and reached Bastogne. American armored vehicles pushed into the town, establishing a land corridor that ended the siege. For the exhausted soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division, the arrival of relief forces marked a turning point. The town had held. The German timetable had been broken, and the bold maneuver launched just days earlier had changed the course of the battle. But the consequences of Patton's rapid response would extend far beyond Bastogne. The German offensive itself was beginning to lose momentum, and the entire course of the war on the Western Front was about to shift once again. When the first armored vehicles of the U.S. Third Army broke through the German lines and reached Bastogne on December 26, 1944, the long and desperate siege of the town finally ended. For the American defenders trapped inside the frozen perimeter, the moment was almost surreal. For nearly a week, soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division, supported by elements of several other units, had fought under relentless pressure. German artillery had shelled the town day and night. Supplies had grown dangerously low. Many soldiers had been forced to fight in freezing conditions with limited winter equipment. Food was rationed carefully. Ammunition was conserved whenever possible. Medical stations struggled to care for a growing number of wounded men. Yet, the defenders had refused repeated German demands to surrender. Their resistance slowed the German timetable at a critical moment. Every day Bastogne remained in Allied hands, forced German armored units to divert troops and vehicles away from their main advance. Road networks that should have carried tanks westward toward the Meuse River instead became congested with units attempting to contain the stubborn American pocket. When the relief forces arrived, the strategic situation had already begun to shift. The speed of George S. Patton's maneuver had disrupted the German offensive in ways the German commanders had not anticipated. Instead of enjoying weeks of operational freedom after the surprise attack in the Ardennes, German forces now faced a growing Allied counterattack from multiple directions. American units were stabilizing the northern sector of the Bulge. British forces under Bernard Montgomery began reorganizing defensive lines to contain the German penetration. Meanwhile, Patton's army pressed forward from the south. German armored divisions found themselves fighting not only to advance but also to defend their flanks. Supply routes became increasingly vulnerable as Allied forces pushed toward key road networks behind the German spearheads. The original German plan had depended on speed. Now that speed was fading, fuel shortages began affecting German operations. Some armored units were forced to abandon vehicles that had run out of fuel. Others slowed their advance while waiting for supply convoys struggling through congested roads in the forests. Weather also began to turn against the German offensive. For several days, thick clouds and snow had grounded Allied aircraft, allowing German forces to move with relative safety. But as the skies began to clear, Allied air power returned to the battlefield. Fighter bombers roared over the Ardennes. They attacked German convoys moving along narrow roads, destroying fuel trucks, artillery pieces, and armored vehicles. Bridges and supply depots became frequent targets. Each destroyed vehicle made it harder for German units to maintain their momentum. At the same time, Allied ground forces continued tightening their grip around the Bulge in the front line. American and British divisions attacked the shoulders of the German penetration, gradually squeezing the advancing German armies from both north and south. The German offensive that had begun with such dramatic surprise was now losing its initiative. What had started as a powerful thrust toward Antwerp was slowly transforming into a desperate defensive struggle. Yet even as the German advance stalled, the fighting remained brutal. The winter landscape of the Ardennes had become a battlefield filled with destroyed vehicles, shattered villages, and exhausted soldiers fighting through deep snow and freezing temperatures. The battle that German planners hoped would divide the Allied armies was instead becoming a costly struggle that Germany could ill afford. And as Allied forces continued pressing forward, the long-term consequences of the German gamble were beginning to emerge. By the first days of January 1945, the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge was becoming increasingly clear. What had begun as a bold and dangerous German offensive was now collapsing under the weight of its own ambition. German armored divisions that had pushed deep into the Ardennes were running out of time. And more importantly, running out of fuel. The offensive had always depended on capturing Allied fuel depots along the advance toward Antwerp. Without those supplies, German tanks and vehicles would eventually grind to a halt. That moment was now approaching. Many German units found themselves stranded along frozen roads, unable to continue their advance. Some vehicles were abandoned entirely after their fuel tanks ran dry. Others were destroyed by Allied aircraft or artillery before they could withdraw. Meanwhile, Allied pressure continued to grow from both sides of the Bulge. In the north, British and American forces reorganized under the command of Bernard Montgomery, stabilizing the line and preparing counterattacks against the German spearheads. In the south, the U.S. Third Army under George S. Patton continued pressing northward. After breaking the siege of Bastogne, Patton's forces expanded the corridor into the town and began pushing deeper into the German flank. The maneuver that had begun as an emergency response was now becoming a major counteroffensive. German units that had expected to continue their advance westward suddenly found themselves fighting to avoid encirclement. Road networks that had once carried their armored columns forward now became crowded with retreating vehicles attempting to escape Allied pressure. The battle itself remained fierce. Villages across Belgium and Luxembourg changed hands repeatedly. Tanks fought at close range in narrow streets. Infantry units advanced through forests filled with deep snow and hidden defensive positions. But the strategic direction of the battle was no longer in doubt. By mid-January, Allied forces from the north and south had begun linking up, gradually squeezing the Bulge in the front line until the German penetration disappeared entirely. The offensive had failed. For Germany, the consequences were severe. The Ardennes attack had consumed some of the last major armored reserves available to the German military. Thousands of experienced soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured during the fighting. Hundreds of tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery pieces were destroyed. More importantly, the offensive had exhausted precious fuel supplies that Germany could no longer easily replace. When the battle ended, the Western Front had essentially returned to the same general position it had held before the offensive began. But the German army had paid a heavy price for those temporary gains. For the Allies, the victory carried a different meaning. The successful defense of Bastogne and the rapid counterattack launched by Patton's army demonstrated the growing strength and flexibility of Allied command. The maneuver that had redirected more than 250,000 soldiers in less than 2 days became one of the most studied operational movements of the war. Military historians later pointed to the decision made on December 19, 1944, as a defining moment of the battle. While German planners had expected weeks before the Allies could respond, the Allied counterattack had begun in just 48 hours, and that speed had helped break the momentum of Germany's final major offensive in the West. The war itself, however, was not yet finished. Across Europe, millions of soldiers were still fighting, but after the failure of the Ardennes offensive, it had become increasingly clear that the final defeat of Nazi Germany was only a matter of time. In the long history of warfare, battles are often remembered for their firepower, the number of tanks, the size of armies, the scale of destruction. But sometimes, the decisive factor is something less visible: time. During the winter of 1944, the German High Command believed time was on their side. Their surprise offensive through the Ardennes was designed around a simple assumption: that the Allied armies would require weeks to recover from the shock. That assumption proved fatal. When the German attack began on December 16, it did succeed in creating confusion across the front. American units were pushed back. Supply lines were disrupted. Entire divisions were forced into emergency defensive positions. But within 3 days, Allied leadership was already preparing a response. At the center of that response stood George S. W. Patton and the massive U.S. Third Army. The decision to pivot an entire army north toward Bastogne was not simply a bold idea. It was the result of preparation, planning, and a willingness to act faster than the enemy expected. Within 48 hours, more than 250,000 soldiers began moving through snow-covered roads across France and Luxembourg. Within days, they had reached the battlefield. The relief of Bastogne did not end the Battle of the Bulge immediately, but it shattered the timetable on which the German offensive depended. From that moment forward, the German advance would never regain its original momentum. Historians have often debated which moment truly decided the outcome of the battle, but many point to the conference on December 19, 1944, the moment when one general answered a simple question with unexpected certainty: how soon could an army attack? The answer was 2 days, and in war, sometimes 2 days can change the course of history.